This ugly flag belonged to the Kingdom of Sweden-Norway. You can see how it's a very weird combination of the two flags. The countries were united for exactly 91 years, but what if they never broke up? Both countries were neutral during the First World War, but not in the second one. There, Germany invaded Norway, but not Sweden. What if Norway never declared independence from Sweden? Would Germany still invade or choose to respect their independence? How would that change the history of Northern Europe and the outcome of the Second World War? Let's find out. The union between Sweden and Norway came to be in 1814, right after the Napoleonic Wars. There, with the Treaty of Kiel, Denmark-Norway was broken up, with Norway going into a personal union with Sweden. Officially, the country's name was the United Kingdoms of Sweden and Norway, but it was also called the United Kingdoms. This I find really funny, so let's explore a scenario where these countries remain united. Would they be able to change the fate of the region? Sweden-Norway, as I will call it in this video, was a personal union between the two countries. This means that a single monarch ruled the two kingdoms. You can think of it like Austria-Hungary, where both Austria and Hungary were ruled by a single monarch. Despite the two states being united, they still had autonomy within the union. Both Sweden and Norway kept their separate constitutions, laws, legislatures, administrations, state churches, armed forces, and also currencies. There wasn't an official capital of the country. Both Stockholm and Christiania, now called Oslo, were the capitals of the union. Although, the king spent most of his time in Stockholm. There, most of the foreign diplomats and embassies were located. I will split the video into 3 chapters. The first will be about how the countries of Sweden and Norway united. The second will be about why the union broke up. The final chapter will be about what if the union never broke up and how this would change the Second World War. The two countries of Sweden and Norway didn't get along well, at least during the beginning and the end of the union. This is due to Norway feeling closer culturally to Denmark rather than Sweden. I already mentioned that Denmark and Norway used to be united under a single monarch for many centuries. Denmark-Norway made the wrong call to join France during the Napoleonic War. When France was defeated, Norway was awarded to Sweden as compensation for the Swedes losing Finland to Russia in 1809. Understandably, Norway didn't want to be part of Sweden, but wanted to be an independent nation. This is why after Denmark was defeated, they adopted a new constitution and Prince Christian Frederick became the monarch of Norway. A war between Sweden and Norway erupted, where King Christian Frederick was forced to abdicate and the new constitution was abolished, allowing for a personal union with Sweden. Later the same year, Charles XIII became the king not only of Sweden, but also Norway, uniting the two countries. This is not the first time Sweden and Norway have been united. They were united about 700 years ago, in 1319. Their union lasted from 1319 to 1343, and then again in 1449 up until 1450. These are the only times the two countries were united together, but there is also one more union you might not know about, the Kalmar Union. There, not only Sweden and Norway were united, but Denmark was also included. The Kalmar Union lasted for 127 years, from 1396 to 1523. All you can take away from this chapter is that the countries of Sweden and Norway weren't new to union between each other. If we count the Kalmar Union, then the two countries would be united for a total of 151 years. This is not including the subject of today's video, the United Kingdoms of Sweden and Norway. If we include that, the two countries will be united for a total of 242 years. This is still half the time Denmark and Norway were united, but still a substantial percentage of both Sweden and Norway's histories. This would lead me to think that the union between the two countries wouldn't be as catastrophic and they can last up until the modern day. But why did Norway decide to declare independence from Sweden in the first place? Let's find out in the next chapter. Since Sweden and Norway had their autonomy within the union, as I mentioned before, they had two different constitutions. This was a big problem, although it wouldn't seem like it for the next 70 years. Charles John, the Crown Prince of Sweden-Norway, felt the tension between the two countries and had a hard time pushing reforms. The Swedish government was quite conservative and didn't allow for a new constitution to be made. Norway, on the other hand, had drafted their own constitution. Remember this because it's the reason why the union collapsed, and how a collapse also could have been prevented. It was hoped that with more time, the Norwegians would accept their closer relationship with Sweden. This didn't quite happen like the Swedes were expecting it to look like. The two countries had different systems and values when they were united. For example, Norway could have been considered more democratic than Sweden. This is due to Norway separating the powers into executive, legislative and judicial branches. On the other hand, the Swedish king had more power and his word was the law. This was just the beginning. With time, the two systems of government of Sweden and Norway drew further apart. Norway was becoming increasingly more democratic, with Sweden becoming more authoritarian with time. The following event led to the downfall of the Union. In 1884, things continued to get worse for the Union, with the two countries drifting further apart than ever before. In this year, Norway became the first country in Scandinavia to adopt parliamentary rule. After that year, the Swedish king, who was the king of Norway as well, wasn't allowed to directly and unquestionably appoint or fire government politicians in Norway. This is one of the primary reasons why the Union collapsed. I remember this event in 1884 because I will use it in the alternate history part. If Sweden had become a parliamentary monarchy as well, they could have avoided this collapse or at least make the Union last longer. Sweden did become a parliamentary monarchy in 1905, a couple of months before Norway declared their independence. By that time, it was already too late to convince Norway to remain within the Union. There was another problem early in the Union, the debt that was owed from Denmark-Norway to Sweden. Sweden argued that not only Denmark should pay it, but also Norway. Looking back at it, this decision by the king was incredibly dumb. The amount wasn't that big after all, and if it was forgiven, it could have strengthened the union between Sweden and Norway. The two countries weren't connected by a single railroad up until 1862, when the Kongsvinger line opened. It connected Stockholm to Christiania, now called Oslo. This railway greatly sped up communication between the two sides of the union. During the rule of the Swedish king Oscar II, Norway wanted to revise their constitution that was made in 1814. Many politicians in Sweden felt like Norway would never be happy in the Union, no matter what concessions that Sweden gives to them. This was mostly right, where time after time Norway would demand for more autonomy or would like to change their constitution. Just so if you're wondering, these are the videos that I will be uploading in the near future. Subscribe if you don't want to miss any of them out. Now, back to the video. In 1891, the Liberal Party in Norway won the election. The party's main goal was Norwegian independence from Sweden. If the independence couldn't be achieved, then they would demand separate trade policies for Norway. Sweden stood against the Liberal Party in Norway, since if their demands were met, the union between the two countries wouldn't make sense. Things were rough for the both countries within the union ever since. Sweden imposed tariffs on British goods, which was Norway's main trading partner. Norway, on the other hand, increased their army size and built many fortifications on the Swedish border. The union finally collapsed in 1905, when Norway wanted to make their embassies in other countries, expanding their diplomatic service. Long story short, the King of Sweden refused, with the Norwegian parliament resigning. This left Norway without a ruler, which if you remember the events in 1884 that I already mentioned, this was a violation of the Norwegian constitution. Norway declared independence and Sweden mobilized their army. A war between the two sides was looking like it would occur. Sweden could have invaded Norway and restored the union, but the Swedish people were against the war. This is why Sweden backed down, due to Norway having a referendum where over 99% of the voters wanted to be an independent nation. The Swedish public threatened that they would stop working in the factories and leave the army if Norway was invaded. This made the Swedish king Oscar II back down, allowing for Norway to leave the union. The union was officially gone, with Sweden and Norway becoming two separate countries, without a single shot being fired. But was the succession of Norway the right call? Sure, they are a very rich European nation even today. But this wealth can be linked to oil money that was very well invested into education and infrastructure. On the other hand, Norway was brutally invaded and occupied during the Second World War, while Sweden wasn't. It poses a question on what would happen if Norway remained united with Sweden. Would Germany still invade them, or perhaps they would choose not to? Let's find out. Historically, Norway was mostly ruled by Denmark. The Danes had lost many wars in their history. These losses transferred to Norway, who wanted to be neutral and peaceful. This is why I would argue that if Norway stays allied with Sweden, who hasn't fought a major war since the Napoleonic Wars, the Norwegians would be better off than a full independence. So, how could we prevent Norway from splitting off from Sweden, remaining united with them? In the beginning of the Union, Norway's constitution would be written so they would have more autonomy over many things that they requested from Sweden, before the Union collapsed. Remember earlier in the video when in 1884 Norway became a parliamentary monarchy? If Sweden had followed, the Union would for sure last longer. This means that the king would have less power, but it's for a greater cause. After that, the issue of debt to Sweden from Denmark-Norway would be resolved, with Sweden forgiving it from both countries. This wouldn't cripple Sweden financially, but it would secure good relations with Denmark and Norway. It was possible that Denmark could have also joined on this new union due to the Scandinavian movement in the mid-1840s, where students wanted to unite all the Scandinavian countries. I wouldn't explore this scenario in this video, so let me know in the comments if you want to see this happening. The Kongsvinger line, the railroad connecting Stockholm to Christiania, would start construction immediately after Norway joins the union. This would strengthen the bond between the two countries, where they would be able to communicate more efficiently. Considering all of these changes, I would assume that the union would for sure last longer, but it's not inevitable that it wouldn't collapse just yet. Let's explore the First World War, where Sweden-Norway was neutral in the conflict. This would greatly enrich the union, where they would sell natural resources to any side. It would be at this point that Norway realizes that they are better off staying united with Sweden. Norway already had a lot of autonomy within the Union, having their own currency, armed forces, laws, and etc. If Norway was on its own, then they would most likely get invaded for their resources, something which Norway couldn't protect itself against just yet. The Second World War would roll around, where Germany would invade Denmark, capitulating the country in just 6 hours. This would greatly scare both Sweden and Norway, who would mobilize their soldiers. The unity between the two countries would be at an all-time high due to the threat of German aggression. Due to the German leader claiming it as his goal to unite all the German speakers, Norway would feel threatened due to their language family being Germanic. I don't know if Germany would even invade Sweden-Norway or not. First is the most boring alternate history scenario, where they don't invade. This is for the same reasons as the Germans not invading Sweden in our timeline. The Germans prefer to trade with Sweden rather than to fight them and occupy the resource mines. The Swedes also made concessions to the Germans, allowing the German armies to move through their land so they can reach Finland. I see Sweden-Norway doing something similar in this scenario, making it very costly for the Germans to invade. If Sweden-Norway is not invaded, then they would unite even further, drafting their own constitution. Denmark would most likely also request to join the Union, which would revive the Kalmar Union. This is due to the countries of Sweden and Norway just avoiding the bloodiest battle in all of European history. The Scandinavian Union would expand into Iceland and Finland, securing a very large and successful North European empire. Finland is not very likely to join, at least not until the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is due to Finland being mostly neutral in global politics at that time. I see the United Scandinavia joining NATO after the Second World War, despite them being neutral in it. This was the more boring scenario, where Germany doesn't invade the country during the Second World War. How about we change that, and we sacrifice some realism to achieve a very interesting alternate history scenario. In early April 1940, Germany would declare war on both Norway and Sweden, right after they had capitulated Denmark. The Germans would struggle to make a landing, but they would eventually do so near Oslo. Soon after that, the Norwegian capital would fall to the Germans. There, a German collaboration puppet government would be set up, an alternative to the Norwegian government. Both governments would fight over who is the official government of Norway, starting a civil war in the country. Sweden would send troops to pacify the rebelling far north. On the other hand, Germany would push through Scania, leaving Sweden's heartland vulnerable for further German advance. The Germans would offer to both Sweden and Norway that they lay down their arms, accept German dominance and send cheap resources to Germany. If they do this, then they wouldn't be fully subjugated and enslaved by the Germans. Whether or not Sweden and Norway accept this deal, it doesn't ultimately matter, since the Germans would get defeated. For the sake of this video, I explore the most interesting scenario, where Sweden and Norway keeps fighting. It's impossible for them to win, but they would be able to stall German aggression for months. This would delay the fall of France, the German invasion of Greece, and most importantly, Operation Barbarossa. With a delayed invasion of the Soviet Union, I would bet that the Germans would perform slightly worse, with the USSR being better prepared. The invasion would most likely take place a couple of months later in August or September. This is important, since the winter months would be approaching, where the German army would get stuck and wouldn't be able to push anymore. This would result in the Soviet Union performing decently well in the war, maybe reaching Berlin in late 1944, rather than mid-1945. In the peace treaty, the Soviet Union would most likely get a protectorate over Austria, not just East Germany. Sweden-Norway would be released, where they would unite with Denmark. This is due to the tension of the Cold War, where the Scandinavian countries would prefer to stay united rather than be destroyed one by one. For the duration of the Cold War, the three countries would put their differences aside in the name of unity and independence. A collapse of Scandinavia is possible right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For the sake of this video, due to Norway's oil riches, the countries would work together even further. All of them would benefit from it, with eventually Finland even joining in on the Union. This is great news for the region, which would prosper being united. There is no doubt that Northern Europe would be way better off than it is in our timeline. These countries are already very rich, but they would be even richer with a higher population and quality of life. This union very closely resembles the Kalmar Union, where Denmark, Sweden, Norway and parts of Finland were united. You should check this video out next to see what would happen if the Kalmar Union never broke up. See you there.